Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Dobak, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar titled ALS Untangled, Help for the Internet Buyers Club. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Richard Bedlack, who many of you probably know already. Dr. Bedlack grew up in a small town in central Connecticut. He went to college at William and Mary in Virginia, then back to Connecticut for an MD and PhD in neuroscience at the University of Connecticut. Finally, he came to Duke, where he completed his medicine internship, neurology residency, neuromuscular fellowship, and master's in clinical research science. Dr. Bedlack is currently a Stewart Hughes and Went Distinguished Professor of ALS at Duke and director of the Duke ALS program. He has won awards for teaching and patient care, including, get ready, Best Neurology Teacher at Duke, Healthcare Hero, Strength, Hope, and Caring Award, America's Best Doctor, the American Academy of Neurology Patient Advocate of the Year, the Rasmussen ALS Patient Advocate of the Year, Forbes Norris Award, and Hop on a Cure AMP Award. He has received ALS research grants, participated in ALS clinical trials, and published more than 170 ALS articles. He is the leader of the International ALS Untangled program, which utilizes social networking to investigate alternative and off-label treatment options for patients with ALS. He is also the leader of the ALS Reversals program, which attempts to understand why some people with ALS recover from it and to make this happen more often. He lives in Durham, North Carolina with his wife, Shelley, 2 mischievous cats, and a closet full of eye-catching blazers. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And again, as this is more of a discussion, we're going to encourage you to go on screen, unmute yourself, and really just get involved with the discussion. And then we also will have the CPE certificate in the chat box, so I'll put that in there now and later as well. As usual, we'll have the 4-question evaluation at the end, so please complete that. And lastly, we want to thank the ALS Association for providing the Quality of Care Program Grant to support this presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bedlack.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's great to be with you all. And you've invited me to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is alternative and off-label treatments. I'm told I have 20 minutes to get through this presentation, so I'm going to talk fast, but then we'll have plenty of time for questions after. So hopefully it's obvious to everyone on this call that we've made progress in ALS. I started 25 years ago, and we have a lot more things that we can offer people now than we did when I started. But unfortunately, none of these stop or reverse the disease. So for most people with ALS, it's going to be disabling and it's going to be life-shortening. And, you know, when any human being is faced with that, of course, they're going to want access to experimental treatments. And I think there's 3 main pathways by which people with any disease can access experimental treatments: clinical trials, expanded access programs, and then self-experimentation with alternative and off-label treatments. And so clinical trials would be my preferred pathway by which anyone would access experimental therapies, because we know a lot about the products. We know they have plausible mechanisms. We know about their purity. There's a consent process, so we know that patients understand what they're getting into. There's oversight from the FDA, from the IRB, from data safety monitoring boards, so risks are minimized. There's rigorous data collection, so we know exactly what happened to a large number of people who took this thing. And then finally, there are benefits to being in a clinical trial. There's the hope benefit, which I'm more and more convinced is huge, but there's also an altruism benefit, that something good is coming out of this terrible diagnosis. Finally, there may even be a medical benefit. There is research in other fields suggesting that people who participate in clinical trials, no matter what they get, even a placebo, they do better medically than people who don't participate in trials. And, you know, it could be the hope factor, it could be the altruism factor, it could just be the excess number of times that they're seen and all the measurements that are made where we pick up complications earlier. But there's some problems with trials. First, there aren't nearly enough of them. So I would say last year we had more slots in clinical trials around the world than I've ever seen in my life. And I would say at peak, there probably were 2,000 slots available to people with ALS in trials all over the world. So there probably are around 300,000 people living with ALS worldwide. So you could see there aren't nearly enough clinical trial slots. To make matters worse, trials tend to be geographically restricted. Most trials are done at large academic medical centers, which can be hundreds of miles away from where a person lives. And trials tend to have a lot of rules. Their inclusion criteria are getting more and more narrow as we start to target specific disease subtypes. Like some trials are only looking for people with a certain mutation. Some trials are only looking for people within the first 2 years of their symptoms who have a forced vital capacity of greater than 70 or 80%. And I mean, we understand the science of why they're doing that because they're trying to give themselves the best chance of seeing a signal in a really noisy disease. But that doesn't make it any easier when, 95% of your patients who come through your clinic don't qualify for the trials that you can offer. The other thing is, even for patients who do qualify, sometimes trials have design features that are not acceptable. Some patients just are not able to come in for the large number of in-person visits that some trials require. And some trials, in fact, most trials, have placebo groups, and not every patient is going to put up with the use of a placebo for some length of time. So then we come to expanded access programs. So if you want to learn a little bit about the history of expanded access programs, I would highly recommend the movie Dallas Buyers Club, which talks about really the origin of these back in the early days of HIV, when we had a similar situation to what we see in ALS, a disease that we didn't understand that well, where we didn't have a lot of effective therapies and not nearly enough trials. And so the FDA recognized there needed to be another pathway for people to access experimental medicines that were in trials, even when they couldn't get into a trial, and they created expanded access. And the nice thing here is it's the same products that are in trials. It's the same kind of oversight. There is some data collection. It's not as rigorous as what we get in a clinical trial. And I think that patients still probably get the same benefits that we talked about: hope, altruism, and maybe even those medical benefits. But again, there's not nearly enough of these. There's even fewer EAPs than there are trials. And these are even more geographically restricted. I would say that probably somewhere on the order of 5% of the sites around the world that do clinical trials have ever offered an expanded access program in ALS. And even these have rules, so not all patients will qualify. And so we're left with the third and by far the most common pathway that people use to self-experiment, and that's self-experimentation. And I would, in my estimate, 25 years, 5,000 patients that I've seen, about 99% are using this pathway. And there's different specific ways to do it. Doctor could write a prescription for something that's off label. Like right now, I've heard some doctors are writing prescriptions for celecoxib and ciprofloxacin, the two ingredients in something called Prime C. A patient could import something that's approved for use in another country, but not here. So for a while, people were doing this with edaravone before it got FDA approved. And I know some people are actually importing something called clenbuterol from other countries. Back in the days of HIV, when that movie Dallas Buyers Club was made, they often got these products through a buyers club. So there was no internet back then, of course. And what would happen was gurus, like the one Matthew McConaughey played, would drive down to Texas and they would pick up a whole bunch of stuff, most of which wasn't even properly labeled, and they would come back and sell it out of a hotel room. And there was such a desperation to try something that there would be lines, sometimes many blocks long, of people to buy these things. We don't need these kinds of in-person buyers clubs anymore because we have the internet. And if you just ever pull out your phone or your computer and do a quick Google search of ALS treatment, you'll probably come up with several 100,000 hits. Now, not everything that comes up, of course, is an off-label or alternative therapy, but most of the things that come up are. And you can see on these websites that people advertising stuff on the internet can pretty much say whatever they want about their product. They can say it's highly efficacious and perfectly safe without really having any evidence to back those claims up. And you can see some of those examples of those statements here on this screenshot from a product that's no longer around, but probably 5 or 6 years ago, a patient brought this to me and said, "How come you haven't offered me Mototab? It's supposed to be the world's most proven therapy, and you haven't even offered it to me." So we had a conversation about the fact that any of these links on this website, if you click them, you would get a screen that came up that said data soon to be presented. There never was any data. So this never really was clinically proven, nor was it perfectly safe, nor was it the world's most relied upon therapy. And it's kind of funny to read those things, kind of silly, but it's not funny when you realize that people are being harmed by these types of websites. And there's a variety of different types of harm that come to people who pursue alternative and off-label treatments in ALS or other fields, financial. So some of these things cost hundreds, some cost thousands, some cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in fact, I recently heard of one that cost over $1 million. Of course, insurance doesn't pay for any of this. There are physical harms. So even in clinics that said they were perfectly safe, we have found evidence of infections, of blood clots, of tumors from precancerous cells that were injected that were said to be stem cells. And there have even been deaths in some of these clinics that continued to say they were perfectly safe. Last but not least, there's a scientific harm that comes from all this, and it has to do with enrollment rate. We enroll at a surprisingly slow rate in ALS trials, about 2 patients per site per month. It's not that different from enrollment rate in other diseases, but I would say for a disease as tough as ALS, that's surprisingly slow. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for it. I've been studying this since the beginning of my career, but certainly one reason is this competition that we have from alternative and off-label treatments. I've seen many people who would have been great candidates for a clinical trial who instead decided to pursue one of these products advertised on websites like the ones I showed you. So frustrated by all this, in 2009, I got together with some of my Niels colleagues, and I said, let's try to create a program starting with a team of us that want to systematically assess these products and ultimately help people with ALS make more informed decisions about what they're going to buy and try. And I have to say, it was pretty controversial. We had some very strong opinions that we should not do this because by doing this, we would just be adding some credence to what some of these products were. And there's some truth to that. There are some strange products out there who continue to use me and say that their product is understudied by me at Duke University, when in fact, it never was. We wrote an ALSUntangled about it and said it wasn't useful or promising at all. And over the years, this has been refined. And the reason why this is kind of always a work in progress is because I don't know anyone else who's doing this anywhere in any field. And so we've kind of had to invent it as we go along. We had to invent a way to get ideas, invent a way to review the ideas, and invent a way to get the ideas back out to the people who asked us about them. So everything revolves around the website, www.alsuntangled.com.org.net. You can go on there and there's a ton of information. If you go on to the future reviews section of our website, you'll see all the things that people are asking us about. And these requests come in through emails, through social media. They come in from clinicians at other clinics who reach out to me and say, somebody asked me about this today. Do you know anything about it? If not, could you add it to the future reviews section? And there's probably 500 to 600 of these reviews on that page right now. So many reviews that I know I will never live long enough to see all of these actively reviewed. And we've had to find a way to prioritize them. And so we started with just something real simple. We put a vote button next to each idea, and we let the community vote on each one of these things. And as it gets more votes, it rises closer to the top. And we try our best to focus on ones that have a lot of votes. The thing is, though, sometimes we run across a product that people want to know about, but which has no useful disclosable information. Like if somebody says, I want to know what's going on with this website, they're claiming everyone's recovering from ALS with this treatment. And I don't see anything on the website, and I don't see anything published by the person running the website. And I reach out to the person running the website and I ask some simple questions, and I get a response back that says, if you write one word, we will sue you. Well, we're not going to get very far with that. So we have a multiplier. Most things get multiplied by 1, which means, there's some information out there. If I get a response like the one I just described, the multiplier is going to be 0. And until we find some useful disclosable information, we can't write about that. Sometimes we actually have a clinical trial or a case series about an idea, and that gives us a lot of information. So we multiply the votes by 2. The review team now has grown from a handful of us to more than 130 clinicians and scientists from all across 11 countries. And really, we'll take anyone on the review team who wants to help as long as they have some clinical or research experience. So we've got, medical students and graduate students and neuromuscular fellows and doctors and nurses and nutritionists on the team. And we've had to kind of invent standard operating procedures to guide what we do. We want to make it as objective as possible. So these guide how we gather information, how we write the first draft, how we crowdsource it, and ultimately publish it. And everything revolves around something we invented called the table of evidence. I won't go through this in detail in the interest of time, but I'll come back to it in the questions if you want to know more. But in general, we're looking at 5 things for each idea. Mechanistic plausibility. What is this supposed to do? And does that make any sense based on what we know about the laws of physics and biology and what we know about ALS? Preclinical models. Was this thing ever put into a cell or animal model of ALS? And what happened? Case reports. What are people who tried this saying? And can we prove that those people are real? Can we prove that they had ALS? Can we get some measurements from their clinicians to see if things really did improve? Trials, and then finally risks. What kinds of bad things could happen? How bad are they, and how likely are they to happen? And in every category, we assign a letter grade ranging from A to F based on the kind of information we find. Once we have a draft of a review, we crowdsource it. So all 130 clinicians and scientists have 2 weeks to read it and weigh in. And then everybody who sends their comments back to me ultimately becomes an author on that paper. One of my toughest jobs is trying to incorporate all those comments into the draft that we will then send on to the journal ALS and frontal temporal degeneration. That process can sometimes take a month all by itself. That journal looks at it, gives it one independent peer review, which I then respond to, and then it gets published. And we have an agreement with the journal to publish everything through free open access. So no one ever has to pay to read our articles. And we're allowed to publish them on our completed review section of our website. So if you go there, you will see the names of some of the things we've reviewed. You can click on that name. It'll open up a summary and give you a chance to read the whole review if you want. You can also look and see that we summarize all the grades for each idea. So if you're someone that doesn't want to read a whole review, you just want to say pick something that has a real low risk, you can just go down that risk column and look for A's or B's. Some of these reviews are getting pretty old now, so we've had to go back and update them when new information comes along. Then you'll see an asterisk. Sometimes we've learned that people actually don't want to read anything. They just want to listen to a summary. And so we do podcasts now. We've partnered with the CREATE Consortium out of University of Miami. And we have a person who has lived with ALS who reads the review, comes up with some questions, and interviews me about it. And so that's kind of a way to quickly listen to a short summary. And finally, we've learned that people who are in parts of the world that don't speak English well, they also want this information. And so we've now partnered with folks in Spain and Italy, and they're translating all this information into other languages. It's a tremendous amount of work. I don't think I ever imagined how much time I would spend on ALS Untangled when I started. I would say I probably average 40 hours of personal work per review. So it's a lot of nights and weekends. Fair to ask, is it worth it? Well, it certainly has won some awards from patient groups and from peer groups. More importantly, people are reading these. So our journal keeps track of its most downloaded articles. And at any given time, you can look on their main page and see what are the top 10 most downloaded articles ever. And we have 8 of the 10 most downloaded. And you can see that some of our reviews, like the one on the Diano protocol, has over 50,000 downloads. If you look at the whole series, we've got over 400,000 downloads. No matter what I discover, my articles will never, all my other articles combined will never have that many downloads. And our podcasts have a lot of listens too, 35,000 last time I checked. And I've learned some lessons from running this program that I really didn't expect. So first, when it comes to the people who are selling this stuff, I think I probably had the same attitude that a lot of doctors have, that these were going to be a somewhat shady group. Turns out not to be true. We have run into some like that, but most of these folks are what I would call true believers. They really think they have something that's helping. They just don't either have interest or knowledge of how to study it and prove it. And I've been in their clinics and I've watched them I've watched their bedside manner, and I would say mainstream doctors should study these folks because we can learn some things. These people are incredibly optimistic. They're great hope boosters. They're very respectful of patients' ideas, and they're very responsive. Most of these folks make sure every phone call and email is answered before they go home for the day. I also learned something about the natural history of ALS. I think when I first started, I knew there were differences between patients as far as progression, but I didn't really appreciate this, that there can be differences in a person with this disease at different times. And so there can be periods of time when there's long plateaus, like this is the ALS FRSR score from a patient on a placebo in a previous clinical trial. And you can see it's not linear progression. It's a long period between day 400 and 550 when they're not changing at all. And then there's a period of time toward the end of their follow-up when they're actually getting points back. And so plateaus and small reversals are tough to interpret. It's tempting to interpret that to some treatment that was started, but sometimes they just happen randomly. There are these cases where somebody actually has a dramatic and sustained recovery of lost motor function. They're called ALS reversals. There's 62 of them that have verified. I don't know why they happen yet. I'm studying them. I have some theories, but unfortunately, again, as I was warned years ago, anytime you start to study something, there now are people who have websites who say, Bedlack's verifying these reversals and we know how to do it. Just pay us some money and do these 47 things and you can reverse your ALS. It's frustrating. I also learned some things about the products. I think I was pretty skeptical of them as a whole. And certainly we have found a lot of products that really do not look like they're worth buying and trying. And I would say we've sort of looked at all of those and come up with what we call the red flags, things they have in common that tell us something probably isn't a good idea. And you can see those red flags on our website. I won't go through them all here, just in the interest of time. But it turns out there are some products that I do think are worth studying. And every year I try to come up with 5 or 10 that I think are the most promising. And this changes from year to year, in part because there's new data, sometimes new data from me. Like I've actually done clinical trials on products I used to think were very promising, and now they've moved off that list and into the least promising list. But I would say right now, these are the 8 that I think are most promising: acetyl L-carnitine, antiretrovirals, clenbuterol, L-serine, methylcobalamin, nicotinamide riboside, quinidine and dextromethorphan, and tamoxifen. And so for my patients who want to self-experiment, I pull this out and we talk about these different things and we pick one together. So let me just tell you my overall approach, because I do think that this is something that I've developed that I think I'm pretty good at, and maybe not every clinic has figured out a way to do this. Um, I don't think that people should need to come all the way across the world to do this because of me. Like this is something anybody could do. And so I think the first thing is to build a foundation. Like it bothers me when patients come in and they're on 30 supplements and they've been waiting for 6 months to see me and they're only interested in talking about their supplements. They don't want to hear about anything else. They don't want to see my team. I tell them it doesn't make sense. Like we have evidence and experience-based treatments that we know work. We know these will slow your progression. We know these will reduce your hospitalizations, improve your quality of life, lengthen your life. I understand you want to fight and you want to take all this stuff, but it doesn't make sense not to build this strong foundation of evidence-based care. You're just experimenting on top of a foundation of matchsticks otherwise. I tell people there's different pathways for doing for getting experimental therapies and why I prefer trials over EAPs and EAPs over self-experimentation. But if we can't find one of those, then we're left with self-experimentation. And so I have sort of 2 different approaches. Someone who comes in and they've never tried anything. Well, we'll start one of these alternative or off-label treatments, one of the ones in the top tier. If you're already on a large regimen, first thing I'll do is I'll go through it and I'll scratch off things we've already put into ALS trials that don't work any better than a placebo. And for some reason, naturopaths love to put people on CoQ10, vitamin C, vitamin E, and glutathione. It's almost universal that you get on those things. And I tell patients, like, I appreciate that certain groups like naturopaths think outside the box. That's great. But they also have a computer. They could do a little research and they could figure out, hey, this cocktail, half the stuff I just put you on has already been tested. It doesn't work. I also remove things with overlapping mechanisms. I don't think somebody needs to be on 5 antioxidants. And then we'll add in a new product one at a time, starting with something that's in my top tier and or starting with something that's got a mechanism that's not being targeted by what this person is already taking. And for each new product, we try to come up with a target dose. Ideally, that's based on a clinical trial. We try to come up with what we're going to measure. So for me, it's usually the ALS FRSR slope, and we usually come up with a duration. How long are we going to give this to work? So my standard is 6 months. And I tell them what we're going to do is we're going to compare the slope of your ALS FRSR score while you're taking this new experimental thing to how it was doing before. And if it appears to be flattening out, we'll keep it going. If it doesn't, if it's the same or worse, after 6 months, we should get rid of it. There's a lot of other things we can try. We just don't need to just keep adding things if it's not clear that the first thing that we tried is working. So just to kind of summarize this rapid fire talk, I think that people with ALS clearly want experimental options. I would too. And trials and EAPs are the preferred paths, but the reality is more than 90% of people living with this disease won't be able to get into one of those. So self-experimenting with an alternative or off-label treatment is going to be their only option. And when it comes to these, like they used to say on the X-Files, the truth is out there, but it's not always easy for patients and families to find. And so ALS Untangled can bring together people living with ALS, clinicians and scientists, and together we can systematically review this large group of products and hopefully help people living with ALS to make more informed decisions. And in the meantime, I'm learning a lot of important lessons, and I'm using these to guide my practice and my general approach, not only to alternative and off-label therapies, but to patient care. So thank you. If there's anybody living with ALS who's here, you're the inspiration behind this project and so many other things I do. ALS Association has been the sponsor for this program. Lots of collaborators that I couldn't do this without, including the journal and all those reviewers, as well as the people who maintain our website, and my team here at Duke, my ALS care team, for building that foundation I told you about, upon which all my other projects are built. So I'll be happy to stop and take your questions now.